Hello. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am speaking from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which you are all joining from today. And today, as we share our thoughts, insights, and knowledge practices on country, may we pay respect to the deep knowledge, the oldest knowledge embedded within Aboriginal communities and their ownership of country. My name is Manisha Anjali. I am facilitating the Toolkit's Light poetry stream with Express Media this year, and I am delighted to introduce to you Lia Dewey Morgan.
Hey.
Lia is a poet who sometimes makes art. She grapples with the continuity and chaos present in contemporary living, drawing formal inspiration from Japanese verse, hip hop and house music, memes, and esoteric theory. Her first book, Bath Songs, was published earlier this year with local press Nomorepoetry. Thank you for joining me today, Lia.
Hey. Yeah, so what I've got planned is I've just got a short presentation on Tanka, which is the form of poetry that I tend to write. So I'll share my screen in a sec. And then I'm just going to do like a quick reading of some Tanka that I've been writing recently. And then, yeah, me and Manisha will have a chat. Yeah. Yeah. Am I right to share my screen, Manisha?
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. Amazing. So you'll have to forgive me. We couldn't work out how to get the whole PowerPoint view working, if that makes sense. But yeah, so for about, I think it would be coming 4 years, I've been studying informally in my own way Japanese verse and the translations of it. And in particular, I've been studying a form called Tanka. Now, Tanka is one of the oldest forms of poetry still practiced today. It emerged from pre-modern Japan more than 1,000 years ago, and there is no perfect definition of Tanka, especially after modernism and the global adaptation of Japanese cultural practices. And as with any widely practiced form, for example, a sonnet or rapping, it adapts to many different periods and cultures. And what you'll see in front of me on the screen share is it's an excerpt from a book called the Manyoshu, which is one of the first incidents of this particular form being noted. It was currently at that moment called waka, and it has since kind of into Tanka. But yeah, so this is 1,300 years old and it still carries a similar rhythmic form. Now, in Japanese, Tanka and Haiku is most commonly presented in one line because the renowned rhythm, the 5-7-5, and then the extra 7-7 of Tanka syllable structure are commonly understood within Japan, and there's this depth of cultural knowledge there where they don't even have to make those line breaks in order to understand the rhythms. However, in English, we tend to break the poems into 3 or 5 lines, depending on whether it's a haiku or tanka, to help emphasize the rhythm for a foreign audience. While traditionally this 5-7-5-7-7 form was integral, poets today often experiment. Moreover, when translated into English, such rules start to break down because of significant language differences following the syllable count. Following the syllable count too narrowly can encourage bad writing habits. So perhaps a better model might look like short, long, long. And if you can see here, roughly, it follows that form. And I'm just going to turn over to the next one. Yeah, so it is the root form from which haiku was extracted. And tanka is generally a little longer than haiku, but both should be able to be said within one breath. Wherever possible, excess words should be disregarded, refining the memory to its essence. This allows the poem to transcend its specific context and strive towards a sense of openness. These poems are then arranged in sequences, with each unit resonating off the next like vertebrae aligning within a spinal cord. Emphasizing observation, haiku and tanka will generally avoid descriptive words and simile, two techniques beyond common in popular poetry today in the West. The feelings in the poem should be inferred as opposed to stated directly, allowing the audience to come to their own conclusion and contemplate the poet's meaning on their own. Now, haiku is very popular, and is popular around the world, actually, for its ability to observe the outside world and the inner peace the writer practices as they develop their own awareness. Tanka, however, remains a little more mysterious, hidden in the mud of subjective experience, often eschewed by haiku. Now, traditionally, tanka was exchanged between lovers the morning after an affair, used to indicate the quality of a partner's feelings for the other, most famously in the classic novel The Tale of Genji, often regarded as one of the oldest novels written by a woman. And it peppers these lovers' texts throughout the novel to add dimension. Back then, tanka's vocabulary was deeply intertextual, restraining itself to words only used in canonical texts. Such as the Manyoshu that I showed you before. And this is one of those poems that I think really captures how much, I guess, like love and yearning are such important topics to this form. Yeah. Now, jumping ahead a bit, this is one of my favorite poets, Akiko Yosano. And this poem in particular is about, I guess, like her flirting with a monk as an 18-year-old, which, and she really riled against a lot of social constraints in her time, which I really relate with. Yeah, so contemporary tanka has greatly broadened the subjects one can deal with. For example, Akiko Yosano wrote about her love triangle and love outside of marriage, challenging notions of womanhood held at the time. Another poet, Fumiko Nakajo, writes sequences on her experience with breast cancer and having a mastectomy. Hayashi Amari, who I'll show you in a sec, wrote with great sensuality about sex and God. And Machi Tawara wrote about dating in an increasingly Americanized 80s Japan. So my focus has been really on these poetesses. And it's interesting because if I just skip back, this Ono no Komachi, she is regarded as a very, very classic poet of the Heian period. And to the extent that Komachi, her name, is regarded as, it's like a way of referring to a woman's beauty. So these poetesses are so thoroughly kind of imbued in Japanese history, or literary history rather, and literary culture. And it's interesting too, hiragana was, so Japanese has 3 different scripts, and hiragana was originally designed by women to break away from the old Chinese script and was used as a way of like simplifying it for women who weren't properly educated. And then it became the most common Japanese script we know today. Yeah. And I love that there's a lot of quite mundane moments in tanka of just maybe boredom or desire or frustration. And that's what really appeals to me about it, I guess. Yeah, now in English, tanka remains underexplored. Perhaps this is because it goes against the grain of common perceptions of Japanese culture as minimalist and depersonalized. where haiku is focused on the seasons and the surrounding environment, practiced by monks and others as part of their contemplative practices. Tanka mightn't fit so neatly with an understanding of Buddhist Japan, as shown before by this idea of like flirting with a monk. Tanka is intense, filled with love and grief, the bittersweet comings and goings of emotion. Yeah. This is one of my favorites. This is a more contemporary poetess writing in the 80s, and some of her poems are accompanied by manga. Yeah, so it's still very much like a form that is practiced today, and yet it is over 1,000 years old. Yeah, and you can see here the lineation changes because different, more contemporary poets are interested in experimenting with how it is formatted. Yeah. Yeah, and this is the last one of the set I collated. This is Machitawara. She is also writing in the 80s. And she released this very popular book, Salad Anniversary, that was renowned throughout Japan, and many, many people sent her their Salad Anniversary poems. And she was instrumental to kind of leading Tanka into the Americanization of Japan, and I guess how Tanka approaches consumerism, which is quite relevant to some of the stuff I'll show you. Yeah. Cool. So I might just read. I compiled 20. All my life, I've been waiting for a good time, morning coffee and blue sky. Living in this time of loudness, taking off my headphones, I listen to the jet engine. Bouncing from side to side in the mirror, my hips prepare for a big future. I bought a brand new pair of Nikes, swept up believing I could just do it. Telling the girlies on the platform, put away your vapes, PSOs are coming. Looking forward to getting Maccas at the airport. Extreme weather may impact your flight. Take your time, you said. It took minutes, and I was ready to be with you. Never full, handbag heavy with water, wallet, a change of clothes, even my dildo. Buying new underwear while out. I haven't been home enough to do laundry. Pristine before my lips open, hungover brunch, guzzling coke. Reclining, she probes my face and sparks fly, the loving touch of laser treatment. Gigantic Adidas print hoodie, I let my lovers change who I am. Men keep staring at me. God, I love being a lesbian. Can you feel it? By the river reeds, a bright green billboard advertising energy drinks. Cicadas chirping to a foggy full moon, awaiting my midnight DD to your place. The waitress admired our drinking so much soju, sharing our feelings, eating pork belly. Beautiful, queer women, and I'm one, falling in love with myself and you. Mid-autumn, wearing nothing but slides and panties. After my bath, I prepare for bed. Watching bad TV alone, the joys of my own company are elusive. Alone in bed, telling myself, this is the body you'll hold tonight. Thank you.
Beautiful, Lia. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Yeah.
Away. Absolutely blown away. Thank you for introducing us to Tanka, Lia.
Yeah, absolutely. I just thought, yeah, it's quite an unfamiliar form, and I think it's great to, as part of my like role as a poet, to also like, yeah, like kind of share that form. And I should say too, I was thinking about this, but I didn't say it. Like, part of my interest in songs is stemming from, I guess, like a feeling that it relates culturally to many, many different practices, and that venerating the song and really honoring its, I guess, capacity is a way of kind of challenging maybe like Western understandings of Indigenous cultures, and of kind of like a Western way of demeaning cultures that put a lot of meaning in song. Yeah, so for me, I don't know, I feel like that's like an important little piece. Yeah.
I love, yeah, it does feel so song-like to me when I hear like your tanker. I hear a meter in my head, and it's made all the more beautiful. I never knew that it's all meant to be said within one breath as well. So I love that it is so contained in breath, and breath is like the means through which spirit travels, through which poetry travels as well. So, yeah, how beautiful that each tanka is contained in breath.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think it's like, because if you do like a really rough Google search on Tanka, what you will probably find is that syllabic form, and that's nice, but and that can be helpful, especially initially. But that being said, like I kind of like the idea of just challenging yourself to write a poem in a breath, and even if even if you don't want to follow the kind of more like honing yourself to a particular tradition, just writing a poem in a breath and having that notion is really, I think, worthwhile and interesting. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. It also, I think of, yeah, the Japanese concept of ma, that interval, that emptiness, that fundamental time and space from which life and meaning grows from. And that spaciousness around your words is so potent, like really allows for us, like for the audience to breathe, and for those words to become attached to the reader's consciousness. Yeah, how do you like? I feel like, and you touched on this as well, how the sort of cultural depth of understanding um, meant that you'd understand those patterns. So it's such an ancient technique. I do feel like there is an unconscious knowing in which we do respond to those sacred patterns that you're presenting to us, and I feel like we do have this old innate knowledge that responds unconsciously to those patterns, or to breath as well. And I feel like this is why I find imagery from your poems like really stick in my head, like whether I'm doing the dishes or walking down the street or just going about my day. And I attribute this to partly the strength of your imagery. So amazing. But yeah, the meter, the rhythms, the breath, the sacred patterns of Tanka, and ma, the spaciousness around the words. Yeah, do you consider audience in the space as well?
Well, yeah. Let me kind of. I'll tell like a quick story about myself, I guess, and where I'm coming from in terms of like how I landed on Tanka, and then that might kind of start to kind of answer your questions, I think. So yeah, around 2018, I was writing a lot of poetry, and I was looking for, I guess, like something to kind of anchor myself to, and like some sort of way of creating like a practice of study around poetry. And I kind of knew that at that moment that I didn't really want to go toward something too Eurocentric. And I was kind of sitting in that, and then I was at a Savers one day, and I found this collection of Tanka, funnily enough, and that just totally changed my life. And I guess, yeah, because what I find is that with free verse, while it offers like a lot of it offers a lot of space. It also can really lose the audience in that space, and it can lose the writer as well. You can really get to a place where, I don't know, for me, I've often opened poetry and just felt just really lost, really confused, and not really sure on what terms to judge it, and also on what terms to write it, and kind of like how to create a metric of understanding for my own poetry. And so with that kind of in mind, in the past, I've been really preoccupied with rap, actually. That was kind of the form that was most around me, I guess, in terms of poetry. And it's funny because rap and Tanka, you would think, are really far apart, but at the end of the day, they both have these relationships with very old rhythms, and they both have, I guess, like you get this sense of, it's almost like a stream that flows down a mountain, and there's different tributaries breaking off, and there's different kind of moments of rebellion from the stream, and moments of being right in the middle of the stream. And for me, free verse felt a bit like, to keep with that kind of analogy, it felt a bit like, I don't know, bottled water far away. Like I just had no idea where it was coming from, or where it was going. And maybe, maybe in the future I will feel differently about that. I'm not sure. Like maybe I just need to study more. But for me, I just had this really strong desire to have a practice. And I think the way that Tanka has kind of trained me is really in having these very clear images, and not writing for writing's sake, so to speak, but waiting for, ideally I want this click moment, this kind of like and then once that hits, then I can, well, I mean, you could start by writing a paragraph. You could write a whole paragraph, and then you could be like, what's really important here? And then you're kind of diluting it. For me now, at the place I'm at, I just write Tanka straight off the bat. But it's a practice of editing a lot of the time. And I guess the other part of that, I'd say, is that I often write a lot more than I release. So there's a lot of stuff that is just purely personal. And there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense in there too. So things that are, well, I have this metric of universality. So I want people to be able to step into it to some degree. And I want it to kind of, I want the moment to come across. But I don't necessarily want to impart judgment on what that moment might mean. Yeah. Does that kind of, yeah.
That makes sense. I love the metric of universality.
Yeah. It's funny because that word has like a lot of baggage with like quite colonial contexts, but I guess I'm just thinking like, like with some of these classic notions of haiku, it's kind of like you're by a river, a rock drops in the river, you know, and it's just that, and that I think is why that form has been exceptionally viral. And has had this capacity to just go everywhere, where tanka seems a little more, I think, bound up in Japanese national identity and how they understand themselves. And so I think because of that, it's been, a bit slower, but I think it's got a lot of charm. Yeah.
So much charm. Yeah, I really love how you describe tanka as being mysterious in its nature, and also the almost clandestine nature of it as well, being exchanged between lovers traditionally. And then all the lives of the poetesses that you described, they all seem to be exploring femininity from a almost like all being women who aren't necessarily in the mainstream, and are kind of on the outside, but are upholding these notions of femininity that isn't traditionally sort of accepted. And
Just one little thing that comes to mind there is, there was like a Buddhist culture of, like women weren't traditionally allowed to become monks, but they were if they were widowed. So then you get this quite large catalogue of widowed women writing haiku. And these sort of like cultural events then create these, I guess, well springs for that kind of future tanka writer and modernist tanka writer to then write about, you know, miscarriages and mastectomies and all of these quite embodied feminine experiences. Yeah.
fascinating. I also just want to say to everyone who is watching, you are so welcome to ask questions. You can do that via YouTube or on Twitter with the hashtag EM Toolkits as well. So please feel free to ask Lia a question in the comment section. Yeah. So I think similarly, I've like in my own practice been drawing from these amazing wandering poets, saints, mystics of ancient India. These women who also, for whatever reason, whether by choice or by circumstance, had to leave their conventional lives as mothers or wives, and perhaps they chose to be naked wandering saints or whatever happened to them, but they wrote this was poetry that blurred the lines between like religious devotion and eroticism, and there were so many theories as to why that is or what it could be. But I was so drawn to your work because it seemed to carry forth like an essence of that tradition as well. And I really wanted to ask, about your relationship between the erotic and the divine that seems so potent in your poetic expression.
Well, I want to get to something that you said about kind of the poet and the exile. Because one of my favorite poets, Fariduddin Attar, who is a Sufi mystic, he was exiled at one point and writes this kind of large book of parables and the Conference of the Birds. And I guess I've been thinking about this idea of exile because for me, when I first started writing poetry, really, I was getting bullied quite hard at school, and a teacher took me under their wing. And funnily enough, they were like a quite well-renowned published poet, Ray Desmond Jones, who, all my respects to him. My book is dedicated to him. I guess just this idea that in that moment of exile, poetry arrived. And I guess it's interesting too, because in the process of poetry is this kind of split between the words and the experience, and this kind of, I guess, like almost like levitation of like the words and the experience. And just like as an additional thing, then translation is like a further, it's like exile upon exile from the experience. And I guess the other thing is that at that time I was also experiencing like a lot of homophobia and a lot of kind of disregard for my body, which to my mind is kind of like another type of exile. And so I was left with this kind of tool, I guess, poetry, to slowly kind of find my way back to my body that I had been exiled from, and back to the people, and to speaking to crowds, so to speak, as I am now. And yeah, I guess. So for me, there's this inherent kind of grappling with my body in my words. And I guess then as I started transitioning at around the same time I started getting into Tanka. So for me, they're very kind of tied together. Tanka was this kind of way of starting to, I guess, create this space to maybe document and kind of mark different moments as they came, and moments with myself and with pleasure, and kind of working through a lot of, I guess, discomfort with my body and with, I guess, with sex, frankly, and yeah, it's interesting now that because I've been writing them for, as I said, like 3 or 4 years now, how much I can turn back to certain moments, and here is a moment, and also here is a moment that I just won't experience again, like this particular type of feeling of like the first time someone touched me in this way or something like that, is so fleeting, and yet it's captured in this little space. Yeah. Now I'm just, I guess the other thought that I was thinking about is kind of like the relationship between like the mystic or the kind of spiritual wanderer and eros, or the erotic. And for me, eroticism has this like fundamental connection with our life force. And so as someone who's thinking of life and who's thinking of divinity, it's kind of hard to get around the fact that life is produced by sex, and that many of our kind of greatest moments of pleasure and many of our greatest moments of desire are around eroticism. And I mean, the world we live in today knows this very well. Like advertising will use this force very effectively in order to manipulate us. And having that kind of clear-eyed relationship with the erotic, for me, is really a way of recognizing my own humanity and kind of claiming that power back to myself. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. The life force, the spiritual exile is really interesting to me as well. It's like you don't have to be physically away from a place to be exiled, that you can actually experience like all these levels of exile from yourself.
Yeah, I mean, women know that very, very deeply, I think, in a lot of circumstances where they're in a position where, they're stuck in a role that they don't want to be in, and so, yes, they are right where they are supposed to be, but nonetheless, they are so distant from themselves. And I guess for me, poetry can be a really productive space to mark that distance. And to notice it. Yeah.
I also really like what you say about the split between the words and the experience as well. I guess every poet's kind of dilemma is that process of translation. And I do have a question here. Someone just asked, what is the name of the poet? The Conference of the Birds.
Oh, I can put that in the chat if you'd like. Yep.
Okay, right.
I'm going to have to put it in the private chat. Farid Uddin Atta. There's a beautiful, more recent, let me just, it's right there. There's a beautiful, more recent translation I just picked up quite recently by Shola Wolpa. And I, up until quite recently, had only read this translation from the 70s that was very through the filter of English literature, I guess, whereas this is by an Iranian American, I think, the translation, and it's much more, it's just got a lot more fluidity to it and a lot more grace, I guess. Yeah, it's really enjoyable. Yeah.
Thank you, Lia.
Yeah.
One of the most common questions I get asked by students who are also working with very fragile emotional states, vulnerable emotional states, and all modes of being. But one question I always get asked is how much is too much when it comes to sharing with the public? And yeah, I thought this would be a great question to ask you, being a poet who works so intimately with intimacies. How do you decide what remains private and then what is public?
Yeah, there's a couple of tricks here for me. First of all, like, I think it's really important to write everything. So never, you know, it's kind of, there's that common notion of learning how to get rid of the editor while you're writing. And in terms of your privacy, I think it's a great practice too. It's great to have really private poems. There are quite a few poems I have that are, it's not that I don't want to share private details about myself. It might be that it just doesn't make sense to other people. It's a poem for that person who I had that experience with, and they will really appreciate it, and that's great. I think it's great if you write a poem and that makes you feel like you understand your emotional experience better. Fantastic. Like, that's what poetry is there for. And if you never publish and yet you still write poetry, honestly, I just think that's amazing. I'm really all about people who are using poetry in a practical way to kind of figure themselves out. So I guess that would be the first thing I'd say. And then when it comes to like what you release, I mean, one thing I will do personally is I will just let it sit for a while. So there are many times I feel something very strongly in the moment, but given a week or two, I might read back on that and feel differently. And time is a great way of checking whether things make sense in a different space too. And you know, with that being said, you can also share it with other people and see how they feel. And I think a lot of the time, the biggest issue with quite private things is actually that your experiences aren't that relatable sometimes. If it's very private, then it's probably very bound in a certain experience. But in the instance where you have this kind of beautiful universal poem that you're feeling tender about, there's a couple of things I'd say about that. I'm always surprised. Like the things I've shared are quite vast, and I'm always surprised at how little negative response I get. And maybe I'm just blessed by like a very gorgeous audience, but I also think that I think that if you feel vulnerable about it, other people will feel vulnerable about it, and they're most likely to feel seen by your vulnerability, or to just really respect you for sharing something so vulnerable. Yeah, I guess the other thing I was thinking with regard to this question, though, I also often other people will be involved in my poems sometimes, and I have a particular ethos around that of kind of focusing on my own emotional experience over kind of as opposed to you know, like I don't want my poetry to feel like bitching or feel like it's telling someone else's story, because it's not my story to tell. And frankly, I think the thing that you work out after a while is the stories you have to tell will always be more interesting because you know them really well. So it's not even really about ethics at that point. It's actually about just being a good writer and you know, telling the things you know, rather than kind of relying on other people's experiences. Personally, that's how I feel. But I do think that this topic is very, like, I think every poet's going to have a different way of kind of grasping with this, depending on the ways in which they want to work. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Lia. Those are some epic words of wisdom. Yeah, write everything, time, and yeah, just kind of intuitive discernment as well. I do have a question here from the audience. I'll read it out. So you spoke about rap influencing your work earlier. Wondering if you can share a little bit more about this and perhaps some other not strictly literary means of inspiration / influence. It's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my first little like gripe there would just be like, rap is so literary, but that's just me. And I think yeah, like there's a huge field of studies on rap these days, and there's like a lot of ways you can take that interest if you want to, you know, and you can read African American poets and theorists and da 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 da. Like there's a very big body of work around rap that is exceptional. Yeah, so okay. When I was growing up, I had Missy Elliott and Outkast were two of my first kind of really prominent influences, and retrospectively two of my first like queer icons, honestly. And I started beatboxing at around 12, and then I would have done like rapping and just like, I don't know, playing around with that stuff. And then yeah, I was doing at the start of 2020, my band released an album, Chokehold. So I've performed as a rapper, and in some spaces that's kind of what I'm known for. I guess, how do I put this? For me, I get these obsessions, and I want to know, well, okay, if this is my favorite poet or if this is my favorite rapper, who were they listening to when they grew up? Who are they friends with? Who's the person who allowed them to get that album out? You know, and all of those ways of thinking about kind of like a network of creatives applies to, like, I really learned that way of approaching and digging using hip hop's language. I learned that way of digging through hip hop, and then I actually applied that to Tanka. And it was kind of with the the wisdom of, I guess, just like a lot of time nerding out on hip hop, and thinking about, I guess, like how you learn, like how you learn about a culture and how you learn about a cultural practice. And I should say too, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but like I'm living on colonized land, and I am mostly English. I'm actually part Pakistani, but I guess for me there was this sense of like unrootedness and a great sense of cultural cringe in Australia too. And so I think I've really pulled on these strings of kind of African American and Japanese literature and music and kind of cultural practices in order to kind of, I guess, understand the world around me. And yeah, for me, they're very similar. However, just in terms of like non-literary practices, language is language, you know, like if you find something that's using language in an interesting way, like for me, like one of my kind of obsessions over the past while is advertising. Like I find it really interesting how these ways of kind of shaping our understanding of a product and basically this magic that is used in order to understand something then kind of flows into our more general cultural discourse. But yeah, for other people that might be like a particular interest in, I don't know, psychology or in horticulture, or you know, it could be like I feel like it's very common though for poets to kind of have these, like I'm just thinking of like one person I've been reading lately, Miroslav Holub, who is he's like a very well-trained surgeon, and then all of his poems have this like particular flavor of kind of surgical English. And yeah, you can kind of do that with anything. Like if you spend enough time in any space of language, you can start to kind of play with it and maybe break it open a bit. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Leah. I really wanted to show everyone Bath Song.
I'll show it too. Mine's slightly more tattered. Yeah.
So Bath Songs is out by nomorepoetry, and I do recommend everyone should get a copy of this beautiful collection. Leah, I think the way that you express intimacy, femininity, vulnerability is revolutionary. And
thank you. Yeah.
pleasure. Thank you. Just reading through the book, which I've read a few times, just the way you're moving through eroticism, through shadow, through divine, and the humor in it as well, and the way you're able to stitch these poems into the skeleton of the reader as well. It's very, very sensory. These poems in one breath that stick on our breath or on our tongues. Little metaphorical epigrams, carrying so much color in bursts of delicate narrative and colors of love, longing, colors of strange, uncertain times. And it's like some colors are hidden, but then we're also shown some colors that we've never seen before. It's quite spectacular. So yeah,
I'm very flattered. Yeah.
How it is quite a beautiful publication. I'm curious about what the process was like working with an editor and a designer to put this together.
Yeah. How do I put this? So Bath Songs is about 3 years of poetry, and I think until like I didn't really have it in mind that I was like writing a book, but then yeah, I think the last section, some of those I was kind of getting aware, but basically I then had these, I guess, 3 distinct stages. There was one which was before Tanka, one which was during Tanka, and then one which was kind of during and after my initial wave of Tanka. I'm in like another wave now. But yeah, I guess like as this kind of gesture of like this initial trans explosion and then kind of refining it in towards I guess like this disciplined femininity and then letting it out again. And also like it was really interesting for me because a lot of the poems in the final section then still have so much of the rhythm of Tanka, but I've kind of let myself write freely again. And it's interesting kind of, I'm a big believer in having constraints and then breaking them, and then having constraints and then breaking them, and kind of this like breath in and breathe out process. Now, just in terms of like designing the book, I worked with Joshua and Dan at No More Poetry. I sent a initial manuscript without being prompted, but one of my friends was published with them, Chun Jiao Chu, who I love their book. And yeah, I just felt it was right. And yeah, from there, actually, like a lot of the editing was done by my mum. She has a very fine tooth comb for like a lot of tiny things, and she's very good at pointing out when something isn't clear and clarifying it. That's a great thing for a poet, just someone who says, wait, what do you mean by this? It's very useful. Yeah, like a lot of lines that wouldn't have quite rung in the same way are her blessing. And then once we arrived at that final manuscript, after working through both Dan and my mum's notes, Dan's notes were quite brief, but lovely. And then Joshua kind of worked on the layout, and the cover is actually, I was kind of given free rein, and the cover is based on a type of origami paper that I used to use as a child. So that kind of speaks to, I guess, like a depth of interaction with Japanese culture that I've had. Yeah, but I mean, it takes on like a whole new meaning on the cover. Yeah. Yeah, and other than that, yeah, like Joshua has this wonderful touch with these designs that they do that just gives the book a lot of grace, I guess. Yeah, like the other editions in No More Poetry series look very similar, and that was very attractive to me. I liked how clean it felt. Yeah.
Beautiful. I do have another question from Emma. Would love to hear about your art practice and the relationship it has to your writing practice.
Yeah. So generally, I think of myself. I was writing poetry a lot and making quite a bit of art too as a teenager. And then something happened, and I really didn't want to be a poet or something. I was very frustrated by it. And for a while, I did photography. And it's interesting because photography also has this great observation practice, and this way in which you're kind of drawing back, so to speak, and creating that distance in order to make space for kind of interpretation and growth of meaning. Yeah, and I guess, how do I like as I think about it now, I spent like 6 years in art school, and I guess I got quite frustrated with some norms in the art world right now. So I feel like coming back to poetry was a way of rediscovering where my body was in the work and where my kind of subjectivity was in the work, where prior to that I had been very outward focused and very much kind of like trying to, I don't know, like bring the whole world down into my work or something. Yeah, which I feel is like much easier to do when I'm just like speaking quite frankly about my internal experience. Yeah. So it's a conflicted relationship I have with art right now. Yeah, and for me, poetry just feels, I don't know, a lot more pure or something. And it's a very personal understanding of it too. Like, I'm not saying that just is how it is. Yeah, I guess like one other thing I would say is that I've done quite a bit of printmaking, and I'm quite interested in, I guess, like the ways in which a book is made, and this relationship with, I did quite a bit of letterpress, where you align each letter in order to make these prints. And yeah, like I'm quite, I find it fascinating how different forms, different mediums produce different forms and kind of have different biases in the same way that Tanka has a certain biases. So yeah, maybe that's like, it's a big topic, but that begins to kind of gesture at my thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you, Lia. We are out of time, but thank you so much for all your wisdoms, for
Such a
sharing.
pleasure. Yeah. Thank you so much for your questions, Manisha, and all your wisdom too. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Pleasure. We are so lucky, Lia. And for everyone at home, thank you so much for tuning in. Reminder that this session will be available on YouTube as a resource, and it will be captioned in the coming days if you'd like to revisit any of tonight's conversation. In 2 weeks' time, on Wednesday, 11th May, our nonfiction facilitator, Hasib Harani, will be joined by Shirtan for Institutions and the Landscape of Writing, live on Express Media's YouTube. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you all so much.